They taught you the Civil War as a sequence of battles, proclamations, and surrender papers. As if a nation can be explained by dates and arrows on a map, blue lines advancing, gray lines retreating, and then the whole story ends neatly at Appomattox like a book closing on a final page. But there is a Civil War story your history teacher rarely had time to tell, because it doesn't sit comfortably under a statue and it doesn't fit in the clean language of casualties. It begins in a one-room schoolhouse that stopped teaching children and started collecting the pieces of men. And it begins with a ledger that was never meant to survive. In the spring of 1864, not far from the tangled earthworks around Spotsylvania, a temporary field hospital was set up wherever there was space and a roof that didn't leak too badly. The schoolhouse had a bell used to call children to lessons. Now the bell called stretcher bearers to more bodies. And every ring sounded like a reminder that the country was learning something it didn't want to remember. Inside, the air was thick with damp wool, sweat, smoke, and that iron smell that clings to places where blood has soaked into wood. The wounded lay in rows on straw and blankets, some whispering, some praying, some staring at the ceiling as if they had already stepped halfway out of themselves. A nurse named Clara Watkins moved through them with her sleeves rolled up, hands raw from cold water and harsh soap, and a calm that was less a personality trait than a decision she had to remake every hour. She was not famous. She would not be quoted in speeches. She would not be taught as a key figure. She was one of thousands of women who became the quiet infrastructure of survival. And that anonymity is part of why her story matters. Clara had come to the front with a small satchel, a few basic supplies, and grief she didn't advertise. She had lost a brother early in the war, and as the conflict dragged on, she began to understand that the danger wasn't only dying, it was disappearing in the paperwork after you died. The first time she realized that, she was standing beside a table where a surgeon, exhausted and steady-handed, worked by lantern light. An orderly held a book and attendance register from the schoolhouse. Ripped from its binding because actual medical forms were scarce, the orderly wrote names down fast, misspelled, shortened, smudged by rain and shaking hands. It was supposed to be a temporary record, something to help keep the chaos from swallowing everything. But Clara watched the orderly pause over a soldier whose voice had gone thin. The man could still speak, barely, and he forced his name out through clenched teeth like it was the last thing he owned. The orderly hesitated, then scribbled something close enough and moved on. "If we don't write it down," the orderly murmured almost kindly, "it's like you never existed." Clara thought it was a comforting phrase at first, a little lie people tell in hard places. Then she began noticing the other side of it. She began seeing how easily names were altered, softened, reduced, or omitted. Not always from malice, sometimes from haste, sometimes from bias, sometimes from the simple fact that a tired clerk can shape history more than any speech. The official roster, the one meant for reports and for commanders, was kept separately, neat and disciplined, full of numbers and categories. The attendance ledger was messier and truer. It held descriptions like died before dawn, missing after the woods, sent back too soon, fever, amputation, words that never make it onto monuments. Clara started copying details from the attendance ledger into her own small notebook at night, because she could feel, in her bones, that the messier truth was the one most likely to be cleaned later. 2 days into the schoolhouse hospital's operation, a group of wounded United States colored troops arrived from a nearby skirmish. Brought in quietly, uniforms muddy, faces tight with the knowledge that capture could mean something worse than imprisonment. Clara helped lift one of them onto straw near the wall, and he looked at her with a directness that made her steady her breath. "Are we on the roll, ma'am?" he asked softly, "or are we just numbers to them?" He said his name was Corporal Isaiah Freeman. Clara had heard the phrase colored troops spoken by some officers as if it were one word, one category, one mass. She had also heard how quickly categories become excuses for omission. She wrote Isaiah Freeman's name down carefully, letter by letter, and promised herself she wouldn't let the ledger turn him into a blur. That was the first vow. The second vow came when she discovered there were two versions of truth being built side by side. One meant to be spoken and one meant to be filed away. Late that evening, she overheard a staff officer, boots clean, hands clean, voice calm, telling someone near the door that certain entries were sensitive, that reports needed to remain orderly, that details could harm public morale. Clara didn't fully understand what he meant until the next morning, when she opened the attendance ledger and found a page missing. Not torn messily in the chaos. Removed cleanly, like someone plucked a leaf from a book and expected the tree to keep looking whole. The page that vanished was the page where she had written down the USCT names. Clara stood very still, fingers pressed to the torn binding, and felt the war shift inside her. Soldiers are taught to fear bullets. That morning, Clara learned to fear paperwork. After the missing page, the schoolhouse felt narrower, as if the walls had moved closer without anyone touching them. The wounded kept coming in waves, and the work demanded the same urgency as before. But Claire's attention sharpened into something else: vigilance. She began to watch not only the men on the floor, but the men who carried clipboards. She watched which hands touched the ledger, which eyes lingered, which voices used words like clean and appropriate to describe records that were anything but. She asked the orderly who kept the attendance book what happened to the missing page, and at first he pretended not to know. Later, when the lanterns were low and the room smelled of damp straw and sweat, he admitted what Clara already feared. It was ordered, he whispered. The staff man said it would cause trouble. He said the report needs to be clean. Clean. As if truth were a stain. Clara tried to keep her anger from flashing across her face because she understood something that day that no one had taught her. You can't fight authority in a hospital by shouting. You fight it by surviving long enough to outlast it, by being careful, by moving reality from one place to another before someone can lock a door on it. So she began a second ledger, not official, not visible, built out of scraps and stolen minutes. She copied names onto the backs of ration papers, onto linen tags, onto folded notes meant for families. She wrote with small, disciplined handwriting, the kind that could be tucked into a seam. She taught a drummer boy named Eli Porter to spell the names correctly, because children remember what exhausted adults forget to protect. Eli was 16 and looked younger when he wasn't trying to. He'd been assigned to carry water and hold lanterns and run messages, work that kept him near suffering without giving him any power over it. After the missing page, Clara saw Eli's innocence begin to peel away in layers. He watched men beg for their mothers. He watched a surgeon make decisions that sounded like math because there wasn't time for sentiment. He watched Clara write names with a seriousness that made him uneasy, like he was witnessing a kind of theft. One night he asked, "Why the names, Miss Watkins? Why so careful?" Clara answered with honesty that felt almost rude. "Because someday someone will write the story," she said. "And if the only thing they write is numbers, the easiest men to forget will be the first to disappear." Eli nodded as if he understood, then flinched when a scream rose from the corner where a wounded man was being restrained. The war did not care that Eli was a child. The war recruited everyone it touched, even if the uniform didn't fit. As week turned into week, the Overland Campaign's grinding pace filled hospitals like this one. Men arrived with wounds that were not clean punctures but shattered bone, torn muscle, infections simmering under skin that looked fine at first glance. Clara learned to recognize the smell of rot before it became visible, a sweet, sour odor that made your stomach tighten. She learned that medical knowledge in 1864 was advancing under pressure, and yet still limited by the lack of antisepsis many modern people take for granted. In the schoolhouse, tools were wiped, rinsed, sometimes boiled when there was time, but time was the scarcest resource in a place where another wagon could arrive at any moment. In those conditions, the line between saving a life and losing it could be as thin as a single decision made too late. Clara watched men die not from bullets but from fever. She watched men survive horrific wounds and then collapse quietly 2 nights later, their body giving up when the immediate crisis ended. And always alongside the physical triage, the administrative triage continued. Who would be counted, how, and under what label? It was in that administrative triage that Clara began to see the war's hidden cruelty. A white soldier from a well-connected regiment would have his full name written down, sometimes even with hometown and company details. A poor farmer's son might have his name shortened, his unit misrecorded. A USCT man might be marked as colored without further detail or simply folded into a statistic. Clara watched an officer glance at a black wounded man's tag and say, "Casually, we'll list him with the others," as if his identity was an inconvenience. Clara didn't argue in that moment because arguing would change nothing. Instead, she wrote the man's name in her hidden ledger and made sure Eli spelled it right. Corporal Isaiah Freeman returned to the schoolhouse twice, the first time wounded and the second time as a messenger, bringing a short list of names written on a scrap of paper, names of his company that he wanted recorded somewhere safe. His expression when he handed it to Clara was the expression of a person who has learned that survival isn't only physical. "They tore our page out," he said quietly, not as an accusation but as a fact. Clara nodded. "I'm writing you anyway," she said. Isaiah looked around the overcrowded room at the men moaning, at the surgeon's stained apron, at the staff officer by the door speaking in controlled tones, and he said something Clara would never forget. "On the battlefield," he murmured, "they can kill you and it's done. In the records, they can kill you again." Those words sat in Clara's mind like a stone. 2 days later, the same staff officer announced that the hospital would be moved. He spoke like he was relocating supplies. "This location is too visible," he said. "Operations will shift west. Records will be forwarded." Clara felt a chill. Forwarded records could be lost. Lost could mean erased without anyone needing to burn a book. That night, while the lantern flame hissed and rain tapped at the schoolhouse roof like impatient fingers, Clara understood the dilemma in front of her. If she did nothing, the official record would become the only record, and omissions would harden into facts. If she resisted openly, she could be removed, and then the ledger would be rewritten without friction. The only move left was the one nobody teaches: to smuggle memory out of a war that wanted memory controlled, and to do it in a way that looked, from the outside, like nothing more than a tired nurse doing her job. The night before the move, the wounded slept in fragments, waking every hour to pain or fever or the sound of another man's breath faltering nearby. The lanterns burned low, turning faces into pale masks, and the schoolhouse creaked in the damp as if it were trying to remember what it used to be. Clara waited until the staff officer left and the surgeon finally sat down with his head in his hands, eyes closed like he was trying to shut out the day. Eli Porter dozed by the doorway, chin on his chest, still holding a cup as if he feared letting go would mean something else would spill. That was when Clara opened the attendance ledger and began to do something that would have terrified her a year earlier and felt inevitable now. She didn't rip the book apart quickly. She removed what she needed with care, page by page, selecting sections where the truth was most vulnerable, names that had already been threatened, notes about men labeled in ways that would justify later lies, details that contradicted the clean report. She copied names until her wrist cramped and her fingertips stained dark. She wrote not only the names but brief truths beside them, truths that would otherwise be flattened. Wounded while carrying men listed missing but died behind fence. Returned from assault with shattered leg, USCT captured feared. Fever after amputation because she had realized the most common lie is the one that sounds plausible enough to go unchallenged. Eli woke and watched her, eyes wide, and she raised a finger to her lips. He swallowed, then whispered, "Are you stealing the war?" Clara's breath caught, not because the phrase was accurate in a technical sense, but because it captured the moral reality. "I'm stealing the part they planned to bury," she whispered back. She folded the copied pages into a thin packet and slid them into her satchel, then pressed her palm against the ledger's torn binding and felt the absence where pages had already been removed. The book was a body too, dismembered by convenience. Before dawn, the staff officer returned unexpectedly. Clara saw his silhouette through the window, saw him step into the schoolhouse with his clipboard and his clean boots, and she felt her heartbeat spike. He asked for the attendance ledger. Clara kept her face steady and handed him the version that remained. He flipped through it quickly, eyes moving with practiced impatience, then paused at the binding. "These pages are missing," he said. "Explain." Clara chose the only truth that could be spoken without giving him what he wanted. "Blood ruins paper," she said evenly. "Rain ruins paper. We've replaced what we can." The staff officer's jaw tightened. "That ledger is government property," he said. "Certain entries are sensitive. They create complications." Clara glanced toward the wounded men on the floor. "Everything here is complicated," she replied. For a moment the air sharpened, as if this could become a battle of authority right there under a schoolhouse roof. Then a shout rose from outside. Another wagon arriving early. New wounded. Urgency cutting across bureaucracy like a blade. The staff officer snapped the book shut. "We depart at sunset," he said, voice clipped. "Be ready." He left, and Clara's knees nearly weakened with the effort of staying composed. After he was gone, she found Isaiah Freeman near the back of the schoolhouse, weakened but upright, leaning on a crutch wrapped in cloth. His face was drawn, but his eyes were clear. Clara handed him a cloth strip with names written carefully across it, a second copy of the names she had already secured. Isaiah's hands trembled when he took it. "The book won't keep us," he said quietly, "so we keep ourselves." Clara nodded. "And we keep proof," she added. By afternoon, packing began. Bandages were bundled, bottles were counted, tools were wrapped in cloth. Men who could walk were ordered to walk. Men who couldn't were lifted, gritting their teeth. The schoolhouse emptied in stages. First the living who could move, then the wounded on stretchers, then the dead carried out without ceremony. Clara watched Eli Porter help lift a soldier whose eyes were open but unfocused, and she saw Eli's hands shaking, not from weakness, but from the shock of how heavy a human body is when it becomes pure weight. Clara took her satchel and slipped outside into the damp air, where local women had gathered to help, faces tight, hands busy, eyes used to seeing suffering without being allowed to name it publicly. Among them was a woman named Mrs. Porter, Eli's mother, older, practical, hands cracked from work. Clara stepped close and placed the packet of copied pages into Mrs. Porter's palms as if handing her something holy. "If anything happens to me," Clara said softly, "take this to the church in Fredericksburg. Give it to Reverend Jameson. Tell him to lock it away. Mrs. Porter didn't ask why loudly. She didn't dramatize the moment. She looked at the packet, then looked at Clara and nodded once. "These are names," she said, not as a question. Clara swallowed. "Yes," she replied. Mrs. Porter's mouth tightened in a way that looked like anger held in check. "Names way more than rifles," she murmured, and tucked the packet into her apron like it belonged there. As sunset approached, the wagons rolled out. Lanterns were extinguished. The schoolhouse stood empty again, its bells silent, as if the suffering had been a fever dream. Clara lingered for a final minute behind the building, kneeling in the mud near the refuse trench where unwanted things were tossed. She placed the remaining fragments of the attendance ledger under a flat stone and pressed it down, memorizing the spot the way soldiers memorize graves they cannot afford to mourn. Then she stood, turned toward the road, and followed the wagons into the dusk, carrying nothing visibly dramatic, just cloth and breath while the truth traveled hidden in an apron. And the war behind her prepared to become, in some hands, a cleaner story than it deserved to be. The first time Clara heard the official version of that stretch of fighting, she understood why she had risked everything for paper. It was months later, in a larger hospital far from the front, where the smell was diluted by space and the sorrow had time to settle deep in the walls. An officer read a report aloud as if it were a prayer for order. Units engaged, positions held, casualties tallied, and then a brisk move to the next item. Clara listened for names she knew. For men she had watched breathe their last under a schoolhouse roof. For the drummer boy Eli Porter, whose hands had shaken as he carried water. For the USCT men who had come in with eyes full of the fear of being killed twice. The report offered numbers and a few commendations, but the details that humanized the cost were gone. Colored troops appeared once, attached to a statistic, not a story. Some men were listed missing who Clara knew were dead. Some were labeled deserter who had been carried in with shattered legs. The report wasn't loud in its dishonesty. It was quiet, which made it more dangerous. Erasure rarely arrives as a dramatic act of villainy. It arrives as omission that hardens into what everyone knows. In the years after the war ended, Clara watched the nation begin another fight. One fought without muskets. The struggle over memory. Cities built monuments that showed soldiers standing tall, unbroken, as if war doesn't dismantle bodies and lives. Speeches emphasized bravery, unity, sacrifice, words that feel clean on a podium. But the schoolhouse behind Spotsylvania did not become a pilgrimage site. The refuse trench did not receive a plaque. The pages that had been removed never appeared in textbooks because textbooks like efficiency, and the truth in that ledger was inefficient, messy, and morally inconvenient. Clara returned to Fredericksburg once, not to chase recognition, but to check that the packet survived. Reverend Jameson, stern but kind, kept documents in a locked drawer because he had learned that truth attracts thieves when the truth complicates someone's comfort. He showed her the copied pages and the cloth strips with names. "A woman brought these," he said quietly, and told me to guard them like I'd guard a child. Clara nodded, throat tight. The Reverend admitted that men had already asked about those records, not with curiosity, but with pressure. They said it could be inflammatory, they said it could cause trouble. Clara answered with the same clarity that had grown in her over the war. If it causes trouble, it's because the trouble was there the whole time, and the only difference is whether people are forced to look at it. Clara tried in small ways to make people look. She wrote letters to widows whose husbands had become missing on paper, telling them the truth with careful phrasing, because even truth can be dangerous when it challenges official labels. She sat with veterans who had returned home to find that patriotic gratitude lasted only until it became inconvenient. She watched amputees learn to walk again on crude prosthetics and then be told quietly that they were lucky to have survived, as if survival erased the cost. She watched black veterans in worn uniforms, medals pinned to cloth, be treated as suspicious in towns they had helped save. She watched the nation congratulate itself on progress while tolerating violence that surged in the chaotic years after. When freedom existed on paper but danger still patrolled roads. That is the part your history teacher rarely had time to make you feel. The war didn't stop when the shooting stopped. The war continued in who was allowed to claim citizenship, whose suffering counted as worthy, whose names were recorded with care, and whose were pushed into the margins under a category. In the classroom, it's easier to teach policy than it is to teach pain. It's easier to teach battles than it is to teach the moment a man realizes he will be listed as a deserter because a clerk needed a simple explanation. It's easier to teach brother against brother than it is to teach that many men were fighting for the right to be counted as a brother at all. Clara eventually returned to teaching, older now, carrying memories like stones in her pockets. She never told her students everything. She didn't brag about deceiving a staff officer. She didn't mention where the stone behind the schoolhouse lay. because sometimes survival requires silence, and sometimes truth must age before it can be spoken loudly without being crushed. But she did show them the names, copied neatly, preserved stubbornly. She would lay a cloth strip on a desk and say, "History isn't only what happened. It's what survived the people who wanted it simpler." Some students leaned in, uncomfortable but curious. Others looked away because discomfort is a kind of cost too, and many people want history without paying that cost. As years passed and new arguments rose about what should be taught, what should be softened, what should be celebrated, Clara realized why this story still mattered. People sometimes speak casually about civil war now as if it is a reset button, as if a nation can solve its problems by tearing itself open again. When Clara heard that kind of talk, she didn't imagine flags or speeches. She heard the schoolhouse bell ringing in the night, not for lessons but for bodies. She saw the missing page in the ledger, removed cleanly to protect a clean report. She heard Isaiah Freeman's question, "Are we on the roll? Or are we just numbers?" And she remembered her own hands stained with ink, copying names like her life depended on it. Because in a moral sense it did. The truth your history teacher didn't have time to make you feel is this: a civil war is not a debate settled by courage and banners. It is a machine that consumes people and then negotiates how many of those people will be allowed to remain real afterward. The ledger is part of the war. The silence after is part of the war. And if you want to understand the Civil War honestly, you have to look beyond battlefields and surrender tables and see the small places where the nation decided who would be remembered and who would be cleaned away page by page until only a comfortable story remained, unless someone, like Clara, hid the names long enough for the country to face them again.